everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I'm going to talk you through all the books that I read in March. Now, March felt like a bit of a slow reading month for me, although I have a great desire to read now, so hopefully that will be changing and I will be able to read even more books in the coming months. But let me tell you about what I did read. The first book I finished in the month of March was The Professor by Charlotte Brontë. This was our monthly read for the Brontë Project, run by Marissa at Blatantly Bookish. I found this one very interesting. I enjoyed it slightly more than I did Villette, although the two are very similar. This is, in contrast, about a young man who, through a series of circumstances, finds himself teaching at a school in Brussels. Both his time there, his coming into his own as a teacher, as he never trained to be a teacher, and also his various relationships and romantic entanglements. I found the parallels to Villette very interesting, but I also found it very interesting where they differed. In terms of, in Villette, Lucy Snow goes into teaching almost because she feels she has no choice. Whereas, because this protagonist is a man, he can go through many trial professions before he goes off to Brussels to become a teacher. He has much more agency in that decision. I also loved that even though he is technically a teacher at a boys' school first, you only ever hear about his time at the girls' school. Because of course Charlotte Brontë wouldn't have had any personal experience of what a boys' school was like. However, in other moments I found William very... I can't think of the right word. He wasn't entirely unlikable. He wasn't entirely creepy. But there was something just a little bit off about some of his decisions, and I can't put my finger on what it was. Let me know down below if you got a similar feeling if you have read it. But I am glad I read it. I'm glad that we read this and Villette back to back, because it was very interesting to compare the two, but it's not one that I think I will be revisiting anytime soon. The next book I finished was Maurice by E.M. Forster. This was a buddy read with Marissa and my friend Jonathan, and I really enjoyed it. I am becoming a big fan of E.M. Forster, and this novel is no exception. It is about a young man, Maurice Hall, and you follow him from about the age of 14 up into adulthood, and his coming to terms with the fact that he is gay. In an era when it was illegal, not to mention taboo, which is why it took this novel to be so long to be published in the first place. The thing that I love most about E.M. Forster is his style. It does get a little bit too modernist for me every now and again, but he always pulls it back in, and he manages to capture me with that free, indirect discourse that Jane Austen used so well, and he uses it just as well. I think what touched me most in Maurice was its focus on relationships, and not just Maurice's romantic relationships, but also his relationships with his family, with friends in town, and how much of a gray area it was for people even then, and how much it hurt to have a family friend look at you after you have bared your soul to them and say to you, don't be ridiculous, don't be absurd, you're not that, get out now, don't ever say that again. And yet it isn't a sign of rejection, it's their way of protecting him, almost. And how awful a feeling that must have been. I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to looking into some of E.M. Forster's lesser-known works next. Next, as a fun little treat to myself, I read Irish Dance by Arthur Flynn. This was a reread for me, but a reread from about 20 years ago. So I thought it was time I read it as an adult, and I enjoyed it. This book is an overview of Irish dance and all of its history, from how it came about, how it was taught, costumes, music, modern interpretations, modern meaning as of 1998, and indeed some instructions for how to do it yourself. It's a very good overview, and it does have some beautiful illustrations, but because it is so short, that overview is very, very brief and doesn't always explain things as fully as they could. Also, written dancing instructions do not work at all. Even to someone who knows the steps, they make no sense. So if you're looking for a good overview for places to start, this would be great. If you have further questions, I would say go ahead and ask an Irish dancer. And if you don't know any other Irish dancers, you can go ahead and ask me. The next book I finished was The Other Bennett Sister by Janice Hadlow. This is, if you haven't heard of it, a retelling of Pride and Prejudice from Mary's perspective. Now, I had been burned by a few Mary Bennett retellings in the past, so I was a little bit nervous about going into this one, but I had heard wonderful things from many diehard Austen fans, so I decided to give it a try. And it was wonderful. Part 1 retells Pride and Prejudice from Mary's perspective, which for me didn't offer very many new insights, although there were one or two which were very interesting. But for me it was part 2 onwards, where Mary is on her own 2 years after the events of Pride and Prejudice, that things really start to take off. And seeing Mary's journey of self-discovery while mixing with many familiar characters from Pride and Prejudice still, along with a couple new ones. And watching her become strong and confident in herself was the most beautiful process. You could tell what a lot of characters were put in her life to do, but what always surprised me were her reactions to those situations, and that's what kept me going. It can be a little bit slow at times, but to me that mirrors Mary's own growth, being very slow, gradual, and methodical. I would highly recommend it. And finally, the book that I am currently reading, as it's not quite the end of March yet, is Perdita by Paula Byrne, which is the biography of Mary Robinson, who was a famous actress and indeed author during the Regency era. I've only read a little bit so far, but what I find fascinating is exactly the same thing that Paula Byrne found fascinating. The fact that Mary not only had such a varied and interesting life herself, but that she touched the lives of so many very famous Regency figures. She was one of the first mistresses and supposedly the first love of the Prince Regent. She was the mistress of Charles Fox and Lord Tarleton at times. She was trained by the actor David Garrick. So many well-known figures were connected to her life, and yet no one knows about her, which is precisely the reason why Paula Byrne wrote this biography in the first place. Paula Byrne writes a wonderful biography. If you haven't read anything else by her, please do. She has written some wonderful books on Jane Austen, as well as other connected figures. But she writes in a style that has an incredible narrative flow and narrative drive, and yet is still very detailed and very factual. So I wouldn't say it reads like a novel, but it is one of the best written nonfiction books that I have read. So I am looking forward to finishing it. I don't foresee any reasons why I would not continue enjoying it. And based on what I've read so far, I would highly recommend it. So those were the books I was able to read in March. If you'd like to know more, or if you'd like to discuss any of them with me, please leave me a comment. If you read any wonderful books in March that you would recommend to me, also let me know down below. Until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.